How does practice overhead affect the value of a dental practice for sale? Practice overhead is right up near the top of one of the most important features that you consider in a dental practice. Behind geography and collections, overhead is right up near the top for me. Now, I'm using the word overhead. That is an accounting jargony word. All overhead really means is how much money it costs to run the dental practice. So we're talking about paying staff, paying for rent, paying the supply and lab bills, and all the other miscellaneous expenses that it takes to run a dental practice. After you pay for those things, that's overhead. After you pay for the overhead of the practice, how much profit is left for you as the owner is the big question on the table. So overhead is so crucial because overhead answers the question of how much money is left for you at the end of the day. I'm gonna make the case there are two reasons why dental practice overhead affects the value of that same practice immensely. The two reasons are overhead tells you a ton about how well that practice is managed, and the second reason is it affects the price. So let's talk about how overhead tells you how well a practice is run. Practice overhead is like imaging for you as a dentist. When you guys take x-rays, you can see what's going on in someone's mouth. When I get a tax return or a set of financial statements, like a profit and loss statement, that to me is the financial imaging of that practice. I can tell you a lot about how well that practice is run. I can tell you about the culture. I can tell you about turnover with staff. I can tell you about advertising. I can tell you all kinds of stuff just from an overhead number. Now, the overhead number that you're looking for, the benchmark average for dental practice overhead in the US, all specialties across all geographies, is 61.7. So in plain English, all that means is that for every $100 a practice collects in the US, on average it costs $61.70 to run that practice, leaving $38.30 for the average owner of the average dental practice in the average geography in the US, okay? So the magic number, 61.7. Overhead above that number means that there's less profit for the owner, and overhead below the average of 61.7 means that there's more profit for the owner. Here's an analogy that might help you understand overhead and why it tells you so much about a practice. Everybody knew someone in dental school that spent like crazy. They always had the latest fashions, they had that Starbucks mug in their hand at all times, and they were just free with their money. They were in it to have fun, and they weren't gonna let a little thing like budgets or not spending money stop them from enjoying dental school. Likely that person ended school with a lot higher student loan balance than someone who managed their expenses well. The same principle applies as a practice owner. If you're running your practice and you're doing it with a reasonable degree of efficiency, you're going to be somewhere around that average, about 60 to 61, 62% overhead. It's because the average dental practice is run similarly in different geographies across the US. Yes, there are differences in urban areas for staff costs and rent. Rural areas tend to be a little bit cheaper in those categories, but by and large, the average tends to hold true no matter where you are. The fact is, it just costs about 30% to pay the staff of a dental practice. It just costs between 10 and 15% to pay the lab and supply bill. The average rent or the mortgage amount in a dental practice tends to be about 5 to 10%, and the rest of the expenses kind of fill in the gaps: accountants, advertising, CE, insurance costs, and the like. So the average practice in New Hampshire tends to be run similarly to the average practice in Nevada, with some differences for geography. So when a practice has higher than average overhead, it tells you something about the owner of that practice. It tells you whether or not they're engaged in managing their staff well and holding them to a list of tasks and assignments that need to be done efficiently and well. It tells you whether or not they're careful about ordering their supplies and whether or not they shop for their labs and if they're comfortable with their lab and how much they pay for the crowns and the dentures that they get. How well a practice is managed in terms of its overhead tells you an immense amount about things like new patient flow. Is their advertising effective? When was the last time they shopped for their credit card reader, the merchant services account that charges that credit card fee? Overhead tells you a ton about how well that practice is managed. Now, word of caution, you guys that are engaged enough to watch a video like this are going to be the same people that go and try to calculate the overhead on your own. Now, that is something that's actually very difficult to do as a dentist trained as a dentist. If you've got an accounting degree or you've got a background in finance, it's not terribly difficult, but if you're looking at a tax return for the first time and you're wondering how do I figure out the overhead of that practice, that is beyond the scope of this video, and frankly, beyond the scope of me really teaching you to do that. It is something that we do. I'm happy to jump on the phone and give you a sense at any time about what the practice's overhead might be of something you're looking at, but there is no quick way to determine the overhead of a practice just by looking at a P&L or a tax return. So a word of caution, while overhead is super important, it's also hard to get and get reliably. So don't discount the importance, but also don't panic when you can't quite figure it out on your own. So that's the first reason that overhead is so important. The second reason is overhead has a ton to do with the price of the practice. Overhead is the inverse of profit, right? And profit is how much you as the owner keep from the business that you're running. And your business is a dental practice. So if you're bringing in, let's say $1 million in collections, and your overhead is 60%, that means it costs you $600,000 to run that dental practice, pay the staff, pay the labs, etc. That leaves for you as the owner $400,000 in profit. Pretty good payday, right? $400,000, I know I could live on that. If the overhead of a practice is higher, that means the profit from that practice is lower. Right? If the overhead of that practice is 70%, that leaves $300,000 for you as the owner. Both practices collect $1 million, but the owners from practice A and practice B are taking home different amounts of income because one is running the practice more efficiently than the other. Fundamentally, the value of a business is based on how much profit is left over for the owner of that business. My wife was offered the opportunity to buy the gym that she's the general manager of. I was excited because I know how to value businesses. So I got my hands on the profit and loss statement, and I saw that the gym that she had been the general manager of, and really didn't have, by the way, she didn't have profit and loss responsibilities, it hadn't made $1 of profit in over 2 years. And the owner wanted to sell me the business for $500,000. And I looked at him like he was crazy. Why would I buy a business and pay $500,000 when there's no profit left over? Same principle applies to you as the potential buyer of a dental practice. The more profit there is, the more potentially you should pay for that practice. The less profit, the less you should pay. There are valuation methodologies. I like to use one called the income-based method to understand how profitability affects the value of a dental practice. You might hear words like EBITDA, which is just a fancy accounting word. It stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. You'll hear these words thrown around, and they're not important for you to understand as a dentist. I want you to be exposed to them in a video like this so you're informed, but I want you to also know that you don't need to master these terms. You just need to know they exist. EBITDA, income-based, valuation methodologies. These are all things that affect the price that you're going to pay for a practice. You can always hire someone like me or a broker or an accountant, someone to help you understand the intricacies of your specific deal, but I want you to go into those discussions informed. I want you to understand why overhead is so important. So there are 2 reasons why you want to pay attention to the overhead of a practice. It tells you a ton about how the practice is run, and it tells you how much you're likely to pay for that practice. If you want more details, by the way, I do go into more details in my book, How to Buy a Dental Practice. You can, of course, jump on Amazon, just get it there, or I've got a link in the description for this video where you can get it for $2. No matter where you learn about overhead, I want you to understand its importance and understand how it's going to affect your deal. It's right up there next to collections and geography in terms of importance, and you need to understand it. Check out dentalbuyeradvocates.com for a copy of that book. I go into this in more detail on a podcast. There are more videos like this and a ton of resources to help you understand why overhead is important. I wish you the best of luck with overhead. Reach out to me directly if you have any questions at all. I'm more than happy to help you.